Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Boone, and I am the Marketing Manager for the NSFI SR Division here at NSF International. I want to thank you for joining us today for the webinar that the topic is contract review. I'd like to first start introducing you to the speakers. First, we have Mr. Mike McRandall, who is the Business Unit Manager here for the NSF ISR Aerospace Group. Mike grew up in the aerospace and defense sector, working with fixed wing and rotor aircraft before moving into missile defense and sensor systems. He transitioned to the certification body side around 6 years ago and has been working at NSF ISR ever since as the Business Unit Manager, here for 4 years now. Second, we have Mr. Don McFarland. Mr. McFarland is the Aerospace Technical Scheme Manager for NSF ISR. He has worked as a quality engineer, quality director, facility security officer, consultant, and lead auditor instructor in various aerospace, medical, and commercial goods manufacturing organizations. Last but not least, we have Mr. Marty Willem. He is our Quality Management Systems Business Unit Manager here at NSF. Marty has 18 years in the third-party certification business, covering a wide variety of functions, including auditing, training, public speaking, mentoring, and operation management, both domestic and international. Prior to that, Mr. William had 8 years of industrial engineering and quality management experience at organizations serving the aerospace, automotive, and metal fabrication industries. Just want to mention a few details before we get started. During the webinar, all of the attendees will be on mute to prevent from any distractions. Please use the chat function for all questions you might have that you would like to have answered during the Q&A at the end of the session. This webinar is being recorded. All registrants will receive an email within the next week that will have a link to download the audio of the webinar as well as a PDF of the slides. I want to thank you again for joining us today and your support for NSF ISR. It's greatly appreciated, and I want to just hand it over to Don now.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate it. We're going to get started in the same format we usually do. Our transition plan benchmarks, contract review citations, which is our topic for the day, some thoughts on the implementation of that topic, and then we'll jump into a Q&A period. If you have any questions along the way, as Katie mentioned, you're all going to be muted, so if you use that chat function, go ahead and post those into the questions as we go, and then we'll be sure to address all of those as we get to the end of the presentation. If there's anything that's pressing, if you raise your hand, Katie can address those while we're chatting, and we'll try to make sure everybody's working out. Okay, so that transition plan benchmarks, the first and only slide associated with that is a reminder of some upcoming deadlines, the first of which is June 2018, and that's the line in the sand, so to speak, that we, NSF, have chosen to ensure that our clients have all upgraded to the new requirements or the new standard. And the reason for that is even though the standard rides off into the sunset on September 15th, we need time to conduct the audit, address any nonconformities that may have been issued, and perform some tasks within the CD like the cert decision. And that has to occur before the 14th of September, otherwise your certificate is at risk. So we want to make sure that we've allowed enough time for your corrective actions and for all of our activities. So if you haven't scheduled your audit, make sure you're working with your account managers and your allocators to get that done well in advance of the timeline. And then, as it says, the next benchmark is September 15th, and that's the date that all the standards, the current standards based on the ISO 9001-2008, cancel. So your certificate should expire, and if you look at the expiration date on that, it should reflect a 2018 expiration. There are a few that slip through, but they will expire on the 15th of September of 2018. If you have any questions, let us know. I want to start off, as we have in the past, with some poll questions. And the first one is based on Apple, and I just grabbed a couple terms and conditions from different places or different companies that we interface with primarily as a society. So the first one is Apple, and the question here is, can Apple use my comments, pictures, or videos without my permission and without paying me for them if I submit them on their service? So go ahead and respond to that question based on what you think to be the correct answer. I'll give you just a couple minutes here to address that or to respond to that. And I promise there's a method to the madness here. I'll give you another 10 seconds or so to respond. I'm getting some pretty good responses. All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thank you, everybody. And the answer is overwhelmingly, yeah, sure, or I don't know. And let me tell you, the answer is absolutely they can. When you submit to the Apple user agreement and user agreement, you give them permission based on this clause right here. You hereby grant Apple a worldwide royalty-free perpetual non-exclusive license to use the materials you submit within the service and related marketing. So they can absolutely use all of your information, all of that information that's put in there. There is some private information based on the terms of service, but for the most part, if it's up there, it's public domain. And that reference came right off the Apple website here. The next slide I want to show you is for another service that a lot of us are using. And it's basically the same question for the service of Facebook. Can Facebook use your information to advertise, make money on it, and not provide you with any compensation? So go ahead and respond to that. And I'm sure we've all seen the hoax going around. As long as we post it in our status updates, then it's not true. They can't do it. I'll give you 5 more seconds to respond to this. 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So I think a majority of people are understanding the point or had more awareness of the Facebook requirements. But the answer is absolutely they can. Again, this comes right off of their end user agreement, and you'll see you give us permission to use your name, profile, picture, content, and information in conjunction with commercial, sponsored, or related content, such as brands you like, services, or enhanced by us. And that means we can use your stuff and not pay you for it. By the way, the Apple end user license agreement is about 60 pages long. The Facebook one is about the same. So there's plenty of stuff that we agree to blindly and don't necessarily understand what we're signing up to. And that's really the point of this contract review webinar, is to make sure that we're reading this sort of fine print, not giving away the farm within our business, because it does have a cost, does have an expense, and we need to make sure that we're using all of our resources within our company to protect ourselves. So now we're going to get into the requirements of the standard. And one of the things I wanted to point out here is that you'll see that the first clause is 821, and that's the customer communication clause. So a key change here, if you recall, this used to be under 7.2.3, so it was towards the end of the customer communication piece. And now it's moved to 821. And the reason why, I'm speculating here, but the reason why is customer communication is absolutely critical. If we don't have effective communication with our customers, I think it's fair to say that we're not going to understand what they want, what they need. So before we even talk to contract review, before we even talk to understanding customer requirements, the standard is refocused on we need to have a methodology associated with our communication efforts with our customers and ensure that we're understanding their needs, wants, and expectations. One of the key changes to the new standard, as we know, was the introduction of handling and controlling of customer property related to communication efforts, and then the establishing specific requirements for contingency actions when relevant. Of note, you'll see that all of these are the 9001-2015 verbiage. None of this is tied to the AS. This is all ISO verbiage. So all of these would apply. While we've had a methodology associated with handling customer property in the past, we may not have had a communication effort surrounding that. So it's important for us to understand that change. I wanted to point to the IAQG AS9100 evaluation guidance material next. And that I'll show you the website where that information comes from. But this is important because it provides some guidance material directed towards the third-party audit services, auditors, but it's also available for use on the internal audit side. And it's a great resource. Whether you're an AS company or an ISO company, it's a great resource for you to utilize and understand what the expectation is from the oversight bodies, from the customers, from the industry. It's not legally binding, so to speak, but it's great guidance material. So in here, it provides us some further guidance or things to consider associated with the communication efforts. And you'll notice it talks to contingency actions or backup plans. alternate arrangements, proactive engagement, consideration of risk associated with it, handling of the contract changes, notices, handling inquiries, product service information, brochures, seminars, etc. So we have all of these different methodologies associated with getting the information in the hands of our customers, the people that pay the bills and are important to us. The next slide comes from section 8.2.2 of the standard. You can see there's a difference here between the content with letters C and D being a bold italic text. So that is meant to denote that those are AS 9100 requirements versus ISO 9001 requirements. Anything that's ISO only will be in that common font. Anything that's AS 9100 related will be in bold italic text. So within this clause, it talks to essentially what we know and love to call contract review. This is where we're going to review the requirements of the customer's expectations surrounding statutory regulatory requirements, things that they've expressed that we don't necessarily know, and how we're going to respond to that, how we're going to react and address all of their needs and expectations that have been defined as a part of the context of the organization, how we're going to address all of those up front to ensure that we're, one, not giving away the farm by signing up for services that we can't afford or aren't built into our pricing, or two, that we can truly fulfill their expectations given the capabilities that we have as an organization. So,
Don, if I could just interject for a moment. This is Marty.
Absolutely.
For the ISO 9001 2015, it's important to point out that items C and D are not explicitly called out in the standard, but they're implicitly there under item number A2 or B. Those are things that are important to the organization and making sure that the organization can live up to its claims with respect to the product. Thanks, Don.
Absolutely. Great point, Marty. Thanks for commenting on that. And that's really the point behind letter A there, is to say stuff that we know, stuff that they know, stuff that the organization's regulatory or statutory bodies are involved in. Because all of those truly do apply to the contract, whether they're explicitly stated or implicitly stated, as Marty pointed out. So thanks for commenting on that. The next slide, again, comes from the IAQG guidance material surrounding this, and it talks to what we should be considering, and it gives examples of those statutory regulatory requirements like ITAR, EAR, REACH, national legislation. It could be sector legislation, certification type programs like CEUL, etc. Organizational requirements for customer stated or implied needs, lessons learned, the risks associated with it, and then special requirements based on end-use item, or maybe it's a critical hardware or it's a life safety device or something like that. There's definitely some requirements that are going to be associated with that. Ultimately, the organization needs the ability to meet the requirements, both internal and external resources, as well as the operational risk, the validation efforts, etc. So the next slide is going to talk to the requirements of 8231. And that says the organization shall ensure that it has the ability to meet the requirements for products and services to be offered to the customers. And then the organization shall conduct and review before committing such products and services to the customer. So prior, a lot of this stuff was defined in section 721 and 722, and it was very segmented, broken up the way it was addressed. Now it's saying, essentially, we need to define what our customers want. Then we need to review that expectation, both internal, statutory, implied, etc. And we need to make sure that we have the ability to meet it before we commit to the contract, right? So this defines, again, some more details, some more expectations associated with what we're going to be looking for, like requirements specified, requirements not specified, and requirements specified by you as a company. So our customer expectations, even though they didn't tell us what they are, when we know their expectations, we're going to capture those. Stuff that's a requirement for us, the regulatory, statutory requirements, and then contracts or other requirements differing from those previously expressed. And now there's a whole new section related to changing these contract requirements. So we need to make sure we understand how we handle those as an organization as well. Again, some AS 9100 specific text says this review shall be coordinated with the applicable functions of the organization. I'm going to challenge you to say that even in an ISO organization, that's a great idea. If we're not getting the key stakeholders from our processes involved in the review of this contract information, it's going to be tough for us to ensure that we've covered our bases and truly understood all of the aspects of what we need as an organization or what we need to address as an organization and cover our costs. The next bullet says, if upon review of the organization determines that some customer requirements cannot be met or are only partially be met, the organization shall negotiate a mutually acceptable requirement with the customer. So essentially, if we can't do it, we need to call the customer back and say, hey, we can't do this. And you're going to hear me talk to that later on as we talk through the implementation side. But it is not uncommon to say, this doesn't apply to us, we take exception to this, etc. And this is really all that clause is saying is sometimes contracts are wrong, sometimes the customer is wrong. You need to challenge that rather than blindly agreeing to those agreements or to the contract. Yeah.
Sorry, chiming in again. It's Marty again.
No problem.
Another risk associated with contract review that is worth considering is the intended use of the product that you're going to be supplying to the customer, whether or not they understand the intended application of the product, whatever it may be. And if known, if there's an unintended use that may cause a risk, especially to your organization for liability, it's worthwhile to vet that out during this process as well.
Excellent point again, Marty. Yeah, and that's going to help us drive back to this point up here as well, requirements not stated but necessary, and requirements that we know. If we know this is going to be something that has to have an FAA certification or maybe a UL certification associated with the work we're doing, we certainly want to consider that even if it's not clearly stated by the customer. So excellent point. Moving down the list here, the organization shall ensure that contractor order requirements differing from those previously defined are resolved. So if we do come to a disagreement, we need to make sure we understand where we're going to go or how we're going to move forward before we engage, so that expectations are clearly laid out before we commit to supplying product or service. The customer requirements shall be confirmed with the organization or by the organization before acceptance when the customer does not provide a documented statement of their requirements. So sometimes, especially in smaller organizations, we're going to receive our contract by an email that says, this is what we're going to do, or this is what we want you to do. So this is where you as a certified organization are on the hook now to say back to your customer, as we understand it, this is what you want, this is what we're going to supply you, and this is the pricing and the delivery time frame. So you can show clearly that you've confirmed all those requirements before you committed to providing that service or product. Okay, it does say that in some situations like internet sales, we're not going to review every single order. We're going to simply review the content of the catalog or the materials to make sure that we are not we're not overcommitting ourselves through those programs or through the material that's available on the internet, through our catalog or whatever it might be. Excuse me. This slide talks again to the evaluation guidance material and just further explains some of those clauses. It's a lot of what we've already talked about. If there's any questions, I'll show you where this information comes from, and you'll be able to go look at it, study it to your heart's content. The next section, 8232, is related to the documented information that's to be retained. And we know that contract review under the old standard required a record. Now we don't have records, we have retained documented information. For all intents and purposes, they're one and the same. And the standard now tells us we need to have documented information retained on the results of the review and any new requirements for products or services. So this provides us a repository for understanding what we do, how we do it, and the expectations of our customer. Along with it serves as a library for those lessons learned or potential lessons learned for the future. Create a framework associated with how we're going to model our contracts for the future as well, so that we can ensure continued and ongoing customer satisfaction related to defining product requirements. Here's the IAQG evaluation guidance surrounding that. And again, it's telling us the same thing. It's to capture the results of the review and new requirements for changes. Gives us some examples of those. The last clause associated with contract review or the customer communication piece is 824, and it's under changes, or it surrounds the changes to requirements. And really, the verbiage has changed, has been carved out into a section, but it really didn't change the intent. It says the organization shall ensure that relevant documented information is amended and that relevant persons are made aware of the change requirements when the requirements for product and service are changed. We know that through that contract review piece, we need to be doing the same thing. Anytime changes are made, we're going to review it to make sure that we have the capability, the capacity, and the organizational knowledge to be doing those things, along with the resources to execute. So really, again, not much has changed as far as the expectation, just kind of clarified. Okay, the next section, you can see, or next slide rather, you can see the IAQG evaluation material again for it. Now we're going to talk to the implementation thoughts. So the implementation thoughts surrounding this, first one I wanted to bring up is essentially, who do we work for? If at the end of the day we have no customers, we have no business. If we don't have the ability to sell, deliver our services, our products, we're not going to be making money as a company. So we need to understand what it is that our customers want. Then that's where, under the context piece, we have to define the needs and expectations associated with those interested parties. And I think it's arguable that our customers are certainly an interested party. So we need to understand what they want, what they need, in order to keep them happy. Next bullet, effective and focused communication keeps the customer's needs in mind. I've said this before, and I'll say it many times. Those needs and expectations are not a static list. It's not something that we can define once, put into the quality manual, and forget about until our next audit. This list absolutely needs to be reviewed, refined, and ensure that we're continually understanding the dynamic nature of business and the marketplace in which we operate. Legislation changes, the marketplace changes, et cetera, are going to drive different needs and expectations of our customers, whether it's increased or decreased pricing or whatever. There's going to be a need to continually review that and understand it. The last bullet on here is something I absolutely love, and it says the customer isn't always right, and I firmly believe that. The customer is not always right. But if we don't listen to their needs, your product won't be either. So sometimes our customers don't know what they want, they don't know what they need, and it's important for us to understand that and communicate it effectively so that we can ensure that they know what they want and need. If they are simply telling us this is how it's going to be, and we can't deliver on that, then our conversation is going to be very different than, hey, we don't know what we want, we don't know what we need, and we're coming to you because we're the expert. And, oftentimes that latter scenario is really the case. They don't know, they don't understand, and they're consulting with you or coming to you as an expert in your field. So it's important for you to help them understand what they need to know and how they need to communicate those needs and expectations to you as an organization. Through the contract, they're going to define some things, but again, some of those things may not be explicitly correct. And you know that we've all blindly clicked through some terms and conditions, especially when they pop up on our phone and we're trying to download something. And I just put the Apple one on here, but I'm sure we can find the same types of information for every service that we use constantly. Frankly, we live in a very litigious society, and everyone is looking to cover their, let's say, assets. And these terms and conditions are the way in which they do that. Your customers are no different. Within their contract, there's going to be fine print, those terms and conditions. They're going to be invoked. They're going to have multiple layers depending on the sophistication or the size of your customer. So it's important that you truly understand all levels of those terms and conditions so that you can understand the needs and expectations of the company. Now, is it something that we have to review for every contract? Maybe not. Maybe those requirements don't change, but we're certainly signing up to adhere to those requirements. So we need to be comfortable. We need to understand that those requirements truly have not changed, and if they have, we need to do a pretty thorough review to make sure that we're understanding the depth of those changes and that we're not giving away the farm. So it's really important that we as a company read these, understand these terms and conditions associated with use from our customers, doing a little better job than we maybe do on our personal lives. As you know, as we've already discussed, most of those social media platforms have your permission to use your personal information, like location, phone number, computer, even signal strength, and the pictures that you've uploaded. I was a little blindsided when I found one of my pictures posted onto a social media platform used in a marketing campaign for a service that I've never purchased, never bought, but it was absolutely legal, as we found out, and it's something that I had no control over. Once you put it in public domain, because I've blindly clicked through those in-user agreements, I had the permission, or they had my permission, rather, to use that. Remember, this is just our personal life, but we all work in a company where there's going to be some requirements flowed down from our customers, and we need to understand what those are. Some examples here are statutory and regulatory requirements, maybe an environmental requirement, depending on the nature of the work that's being performed. It could be in terms of certification or a company policy that's invoked for a quality system, an ethics standard, product certification to a root standard, or perhaps a format, traceability, or lineage. You know, all of these things are going to cost you as an organization. They're going to cost you money, whether it's quality professionals or management professionals or accounting professionals reviewing the content to make sure that you're compliant, or, you know, executing a more specific task associated with some of these things. There's going to be costs associated. So it's important for you to understand up front what those costs are, and potentially, as we'll talk in a minute, make some money on those depending on how you choose to spin it. The next slide is associated with some other embedded specifications, and they're very simplistic phrases that are inside of these contracts, but they certainly can have some more extensive ramifications. Examples would be DPAS, Defense Priorities Allocation System. That's Code of Federal Regulations. I believe it's 700, and it's talking to the prioritization of articles that are used for defense. RoHS, REACH, WE, some of the environmental legislations associated with products, mostly on the electronic side, but a lot of it rolls up into the higher level assemblies, thanks to our friends across the pond. And they're decent standards. There's just a lot of legwork that goes into confirming REACH compliance, or maybe it's mercury-free, or maybe it's the Dodd-Frank Act associated with conflict minerals. All of these have a cost in ensuring that you are truly understanding what you can sign off on and confirm to the customer's requirements. Some others here, we talked about DFARS last month, and specifically the control of unclassified information, or controlled unclassified information under NIST 800-171. And as we know, that's a pretty expensive, or can be a pretty expensive endeavor, pretty expensive undertaking for a company. And if you see the DFARS invoked on the contract and you don't have an understanding of what that means or what the costs associated can be, you could be signing yourself up for some pretty expensive things and not necessarily capturing that requirement in your purchase price. Likewise, the AS9100 and ISO 9001, or maybe a 14 or an 18 type certification, all of those things have a cost, as we know. And depending on how the contract is worded, you may or may not have an understanding of compliance versus certification. And it's important to understand that up front, because simply stating compliance has a definite different cost associated than engaging with a third-party service, as you all probably know. So we need to understand what the customer
Don.
wants. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is Mike, and I just wanted to add, this is my favorite part of the presentation right here, because of the fact that this seems to pop up a lot in our audits, and it popped up a lot prior to this when I was in business. It's not just in the terms and conditions that you're going to find these things, because some contracts are structured such that they have a separate T&C section. These can be embedded almost anywhere in that contract. And one of the hard parts is, like Don mentioned before, some of these contracts that you get with Apple or Facebook have 60 pages. If you've been with any of the major primes, you've seen how deep and detailed their contracts can be. But you can't take for granted that if it's not in the T's and C's, or if it's not in the header, that it's not there. It's tough and it can be painstaking, but you've got to comb through these things because, as Don said, once we sign these off, we're responsible for whatever it said that we agreed to do. And oftentimes, and I'm sure Marty and Don have run into this a lot, we'll do an audit, we'll talk to a client, they'll say, I didn't even know that was in there, the buyer never said anything, or the buyer told me on the phone, don't worry about it. But if you buy a car and you finance that car and you don't read that contract and the salesman tells you don't worry about it, you're getting a 4% loan, and you sign a paper that says you're getting a 7% loan, guess what you're paying? So this is very, very vital and integral, and this is the upfront part of it. So you got to grab it up front when you get it, and it's going to make your life a heck of a lot easier at the end of the road. And that's
absolutely.
All I really have to say.
Sorry, I was just going to say, add to that, gentlemen's agreements don't exist in terms of contracts. It's what's on paper that's going to be defendable. And I don't want to pretend that any of us are attorneys. I've stayed at a Holiday Inn Express recently. That's about the extent of my legal knowledge. But the information that's defined within that contract is absolutely going to be binding associated with it, including all of those flow downs, as Mike mentioned. As an example, the primes tend to say, subject to our terms and conditions, subject to the DFAR statement, and within those documents you'll find linkage over to a separate document entirely associated with maybe an ESD practice or a FOD program, or perhaps even, some environmental legislation like the RoHS REACH and WE type directives. So there may be hundreds or thousands of pages invoked as a part of the contract that you're signing up to, and each one of those will certainly have a cost associated. So, again, make sure you have an understanding of what you're signing up to.
Don, if I could also just weigh in for the QMS side of it, even without any industry-specific requirements, these, signing off or acknowledging purchase orders or contracts, they will have elements of other flow downs from the standard itself, and specifically looking at the requirements for documented information retention. So how long you need to retain different records, like inspection records or shipping records, whichever type of record they invoke. So be very mindful of that, and be very mindful of who you have in your organization reviewing terms and conditions in documents to make sure that all of the ones that affect the quality management system, environmental management system, or whichever other system is actually being looked at and being addressed.
100% agree. And then I've got a slide that talks to the ability to maybe add and capture some of those or understand those hidden costs. Thanks for adding that, Marty. So the next slide talks to assessing the hidden and true costs. And it basically says, with that complete review of the contract, you'll understand their needs and expectations. You've heard me harp on that already. And once you understand it, you'll know the costs of doing the business, the resources or overhead that you'll need to fulfill those requirements. And you still may be, guessing a little bit, but at least you won't be giving away the farm. You won't be strapping a $5 bill to everything you build. Regulated work carries a higher margin for a reason, and we truly need to understand the costs associated with that and maybe the liability. And perhaps there's some additional insurance or additional liability protection that a company needs to have to ensure that they're not opening themselves up to further litigation or further issues down the line based on what has been assigned or passed as a result of that contract. And this is where we're going to talk about the opportunities to upsell, perhaps. As Marty said, if the customer contract specifies a certain retention period for records, as an example, we may not have the capability or the capacity to store those per the customer's contract requirements. So we may need to engage with a service like Iron Mountain, just using that as an example. And if we engage with that service, obviously there's a cost. So perhaps our standard work is 5 years. And we tell the customer, if you want longer, we're going to engage with Iron Mountain as an example again, and we can upsell that as a service addition that's associated with it. Rather than losing money, we can create a value-added service or upsell associated with the contract. Another great example here is first articles. First articles can be painstaking. They're time-consuming, and if one of the contracts I saw said they needed a first article with every delivery, an AS9102 based first article for every delivery. Now, can you imagine having to do a 9102 first article, full first article for every product that you ship? The cost associated with the labor alone would be just astronomical. So this particular company was able to say, we'll do it, but it's going to cost you an extra $200 or whatever the number might be. And they were able to make additional money as a result of that. The next bullet there, record asset storage and management services, maybe the certification, whether it be certificate of analysis, lot testing, destructive. And then that's especially true when it comes to maybe the counterfeit programs, right? Because there's a cost associated with having material screening done, decap testing done, et cetera. And if we're not capturing those costs for brokered material purchases, we may not be profitable. It's going to be important for us to understand that so we can account for those costs up front and maybe upsell them so that we're making some money. One other one I wanted to point out, it's a huge one, is associated with some of those security requirements. Everybody's heard of ITAR, everybody's heard of EAR if you're dealing in defense or some of the regulated spaces, but there's a significant cost associated with being ITAR or even controlled goods within the Canada sector, because you have to pay for an annual registration. Those registrations aren't cheap, even if you're not licensing or you're not exporting. There's still a cost associated with maintaining that certificate. And don't quote me, but I'll say it's thousands. I haven't filed one for a couple years, but the last time I did, it was about $2,000 or $2,500 just for the license to play.
It's almost $3,000 now.
So, yeah, and in addition to that, as a part of our due diligence, we have to do screening to make sure we're not engaging with customers, different people that are debarred or on the denied parties list. And if we're dealing with risk of counterfeit, and I'm not just talking electronics. If you've been around, you know of Kobe Steel, you know of SAPA Portland, and some other incidences. There's risk, and we need to have the ability to sign up for subscription services or to have the time and energy to dedicate to maybe a guide-up type review. And those things, guide-up is free, but it still costs labor to go do those due diligence type activities. So we need to make sure that we understand all of these costs, and if necessary, and if you can work it with your contract, why not upsell it or add some additional pricing within the amortized price?
Don, if I could also just add a point with the screening process, because you mentioned one of my favorite subjects, records or documented information retention. If you're using a service such as Iron Mountain or others, or maybe storing records in bankers' boxes in off-site location, it behooves your organization to do a risk analysis of who you're dealing with and who's going to have access to those records, especially if you have some sensitive records being stored off-site. Who has access to them? Are they bonded? Are they only using, in the case of ITAR, American citizens, or in Canada, somebody that's under CGD, the Controlled Goods Directorate? These are all things that you need to consider for your documented information to keep the information safe and secure.
Absolutely. 100% agree. So the next slide talks to, again, is the customer always right? And I love that graphic. The customer is king, but they're certainly not always right. Going back to that quote earlier, if we don't understand what they're saying, they're not going to be customers, but we need to be able to tell them that's incorrect or push back. And this, through the contract review, this becomes vital. If we're not able to tell the customer, hey, this doesn't make sense, this adds costs up front, it's going to be really tough for us to go back 6 months, a year down the line and say, hey, that doesn't apply to us, right? And especially when it becomes a part of the audit function, it's a little more embarrassing to fall on your sword at that point. So we want to do it pretty early on. The contract flow downs may be boilerplate, especially within that larger organization. So reviewing those and ensuring that they're appropriate and applicable to your organization, the service you're providing, the commodity you're working with, et cetera, would be absolutely critical. We looked at one at the audit I did earlier this week, and it was for an outsourced service. And that outsourced service was denoted to have, or was required to have, a first article created. Well, typically you don't require a 9102 base first article for a heat treat or some type of process like that. There would be certainly certificates of the lot or certificates of analysis associated with it, but not necessarily a full first article. Well, thankfully that supplier pushed back and said, no, that doesn't make sense. We're not going to do it, because otherwise they could be on the hook to do something like that. As we investigated it, we found that that requirement is based on the part number that was being purchased. So whether they were buying a raw part number or buying a service associated with it, it had to have that code flowed down. And the buyer could easily resolve that by reviewing the information with the designated quality engineer, get that requirement waived, and the customer in this case was pretty ecstatic to see somebody pushing back on something so inappropriate to their type of service. The next bullet says, absolutely, it's okay to push back, especially in those larger organizations, because the buyer may not be included in defining the applicable codes. And they may not be able to resolve it, even as the contracting official. They may not be able to resolve it. They may have to go to that supplier quality engineer or somebody like that to ensure that what they're talking about is appropriate to the type of product, the type of service being performed. So pushing back is okay. You don't want to strain relationships. I understand that. But it's certainly better to ask the questions and get resolution before something goes wrong than for them to come back and say, hey, you forgot to supply this item, and oh, by the way, it's going to cost you X number of dollars, or it's going to be listed as a nonconformity on your supplier scorecard and impact potential future business. The last bullet here is exceptions need to be taken in to the order or through another legally enforceable arrangement. So what we've seen on occasion is that the quote that's supplied will have some specific terms defined. And then when the order comes in, the customer will define all of their requirements on the contract. And I've heard from the organizations we go perform the audit on that, hey, we've already taken exception to these. Now, I'm not an attorney again, but I would say that the contract you sign up to takes precedence over the quote that you supplied unless you've got some language and your attorney feels like they can defend it. What I mean is if your quote says we won't do a first article and the contract comes in saying you'll do a first article and you sign that contract, now because that's the date of that is later than the quote, there's probably a legal precedent that you would have to do a first article. So you need to make sure with your counsel, your attorneys, if you're not going to do something, you've got a robust mechanism in place to take those exceptions. Okay?
Hey, Don?
Yes, sir. Very,
very good point. And the question that's asked there, if exceptions are defined a quote but not a contract, are they legally enforceable? Excellent question, because I've had it, same thing, come back to me not only as an auditor but in the business end. And the answer to that is exactly what Don described. If you sign the contract with something that you had taken exception to in the quote but did not take exception to at the contract, you're going to be stuck with it. The only way you get around that is when that contract comes in, if you've taken exception at quote and the quote had a number or an identifier, and then the contract references that quote, then everything in that quote would be part of that contract. But if it does not, the contract's a standalone and you sign it, you're on your own again. So exceptions have to be you have to re-accept, actually, is what happens when you hit to the contract level.
Absolutely. Contract modifications need to be made. Otherwise, there's a definite legal precedent for it. I've too been burned by this in the past. And only once in my career have I ever had a customer come back and say, your quote is too low. It generally doesn't happen, and generally, especially on government-level contracts, they're going to go with a lesser price point. So even if you're giving away the farm, so to speak, there's a good chance you're going to get the business. You're going to get the contract without truly understanding the costs. And if you haven't understood those, you may be giving it away, even though you thought you took exception to it up front. So that's the extent of our implementation thoughts. I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to type some information into the quote, or the questions rather. If you have any questions, go ahead and enter those. I'm going to go through some of the resources that we've talked about, and then we'll give everybody an opportunity to get their questions answered. Again, using that chat function, go ahead and type your questions in now. So the resources that I pointed to throughout the presentation were from the IAQG, the International Aerospace Quality Group, and in particular, the IAQG resources were from the Supply Chain Management Handbook, free resource for anybody in the world, whether you're aerospace or not. You can log into this website and create yourself a free login and get all sorts of information related to how things are expected to work, how different organizations would prefer things to be done, etc. And it's great information. Wonderful resource if you ever have questions. The other is associated with these standard questions. And right up here, this will take you to a table that has all of the different standards on it. If you're interested in ISO or AS 9100 specific, you click on this box. It takes you to the same information. And yes, there is a section within there that's specific to the ISO requirements, as well as a section for the AS 9100 editions. So please, please, please go consult those resources. Use them. They're free. They're definitely excellent information written by industry, kept updated by industry, readily available for all of us. The next one I want to point you to is our site, the NSF ISR site, and you can see it's nsf.org, info/ISO-updates. Now on there you'll see the AS 9100. We also have an ISO 9001 tab associated with it, the requirements for that, some webinars over there, all of the AS requirements, transition information, etc., along with all the webinars that have been recorded through time are listed in there. They're free to download. You do have to put some information in so Katie can get you added to the mailing list if you want. Otherwise, they are there for your taking. Please, please, please utilize these. Even if you don't agree with what we have to say, it's something that you can utilize to create a point of reference associated with these requirements. Some transition resources that are available from there. Again, we've got transition guides, gap assessment tools, internal audit tools. All the webinars are listed there. Please feel free to use these. These are not mandated. These are not required resources, but they're optional, and NSF would encourage you to use them, even if you want to strip our format, strip our information, use them with your logos. At this point, it's all about making sure that you're prepared and ready for the transition efforts and growing your business in the right ways rather than the glamour and fame of it. So please use those. The last slide I've got here is for April's webinar. We're going to go through corrective action responses. I'm sure you've all wondered, why is my car being rejected? What is my auditor thinking? Or what is the reviewer thinking? So this gives us an opportunity to explain what the expectations are from 17021, from AS 9100 series, so that you can understand why corrective actions are being pushed back, or what we're looking for specifically within that corrective action. Now, we're not necessarily going to address specific corrective actions, but we'll talk to it generically to say, this is what you should be looking for, this is what you should be considering. And I think there's a lot of value in organizations going through this with us. I personally review a number of cars, and I'll tell you, it can be somewhat painful for us, as well as within your organizations. I'm sure you receive plenty of information from your suppliers that are absolutely dismal, and this would be a good resource for you to use to hopefully help boost the responses you're getting from your suppliers as well. And that's it. So we're going to go through some questions and answers. And while we're doing that, I'm going to leave this slide up that has our contact information for both Mike, Marty, and myself, and that will allow you to take that information down if you want. Please feel free to ask us any questions via email. We may be a little slow to get to those just based on the volume that comes in, but we'll definitely get back with you as time permits, okay? So with that said, we're going to go into the questions and answers starting at the very top here. And it looks like our first question is, what is your thought on confirming back to a customer contract or PO with your own T's and C's on the order acknowledgement if we do not sign their PO or contract? Is there a risk, or would the T's and C's apply? And I think we talked to that a little bit. The conversation I'd encourage you to have is with your attorney, with your counsel, to understand the legal invocations associated with it. If you're doing that sort of activity at the contract phase, at the PO phase, it definitely has a stronger legal precedent than doing it at a quoting space. And that's where your customer is going to be on the hook to do a more thorough review to confirm back to you or reconfirm back to you that they acknowledge your changes. You've done your due diligence at that point. But again, I'm going to say you need to consult your counsel and the specific wording that's on that order acknowledgement to make sure that it truly does cover your interests and cover your needs or your processes. Mike, Marty, anything to add to that?
No, I think you covered that nicely.
Okay.
Yep.
The next question here. When reviewing a contract, how do we deal with links in the 60-page contracts? Is there a way we can ask for explicit requirements without having to click on the links? And the reason I laugh is I haven't found a way personally. I've reviewed a number of contracts from the primes that invoke those standards upon standards upon standards, and frankly, it becomes a battle. I can tell you some of those have customer contract requirements documents lists that are in the order of 200, 300 documents that are invoked, and there becomes a lineage associated with each of those requirements that needs to be confirmed. Contract review is not a 10-minute process in that case. It really depends on the complexity of the customer, the risk associated with it, and the precedence that's been set by their documentation. If you have that sort of relationship, you can ask your customer. My guess is for the sophisticated customers, the primes, they're not going to give you the Reader's Digest or the Cliff's Notes version of the contract because it puts too much onus on them to create a separate legally binding document that covers all of their information. They've got an attorney or they've got a group of attorneys that have created this contract listing or the flow downs, and they're not going to be too inclined to go and simplify that, would be my assumption. So is there an easy way? I would dare say no, unfortunately.
Yeah, and with your example earlier, Don, with end user license agreements for anything, you base it on risk. If you're signing up for something on Apple or on iPhone for an app, if it's something that you don't think is really a big risk and you evaluate it and you finally just go down to click on agree without reading the whole thing, you've assumed all the risk. So just be mindful of that. And it sort of links with the second question for this one. Any tips when reviewing extensive contracts? If you're a large enough organization and the risk is there with the product or the customer, that you can take it to either in-house counsel or external counsel to have them look at it, to give you the thumbs up on it, or give you, like Don was saying, a Reader's Digest condensed version of the things that maybe are going to keep you awake at night. That's good. I would also recommend dividing up the responsibility by heading in terms and conditions and have a cross-functional team within the organization look at it if you're not using legal counsel or don't want to pay for that. That way it sort of ends up in the lap of the person who's got ultimate responsibility, let's say for the quality aspects or the buyer's aspects of that contract, and then thoroughly vet it out internally. That we've got.
Yeah, I think that both of those. That Marty is probably the most valuable thing that they could take out of this is do the cross-functional approach if at all possible. That it makes the most sense and it's going to put the best set of eyes on each section of that contract.
And I was looking for this slide in particular, Section 8231. Under AS, that's a requirement. We need to coordinate with the applicable functions within the organizations, and I think it's arguable that within the ISO scheme, that's an implied requirement, but not necessarily explicit. It's definitely in our best interest as an organization to ensure that we get the stakeholders involved in reviewing the content that's applicable to their world, because they're going to live and breathe that. And if they have an understanding of it, they're probably going to have the ability to ensure that their changes within their scope of work aren't going to be made at haste and impacting our ability to fulfill contract requirements over the long haul.
That also brings up the point with the applicable functions within the organization. Don't be afraid to tap top management on the shoulder and ask for help with this, because in the world of ITAR and EAR, ultimately in the organization, the top management person is ultimately responsible for the actions of the organization, and real penalties that are associated with violations of that. So make sure that top management is engaged where they need to be with signing off on contracts or accepting terms and conditions.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Wearing that empowered.
One thing real quickly to that part of it, and that's Marty's exactly right. But I've heard back and forth a few times about going to a legal entity within the company, and that can be very helpful to make sure that we're not hung up on something that could end up costing us a lot or really putting us in jeopardy. But you do remember, if you bring it to a legal entity to do a review of your contract, and there's a first article requirement or something like that, they're more than likely not going to be able to help you with what that's going to entail as far as how much risk it puts on you or how much onus it puts on the financial responsibility that falls on that. Because like Don had said before, that can be very costly. So having the individual applicable functions looking at these things makes, to me, a lot better sense, at least in the flow down aspect, not in the legalities, but in the flow down of what you're required to do to present at the end of this order what that client contracted you to do.
Agreed. Excellent point. Okay. And so the next question here is related to, should our day-to-day confirmation of orders have a legal disclaimer regarding the subjects you discussed? We have an in-house attorney. I'm gonna not answer that one simply because I don't want to be held responsible for this. Instead, I'll point you to your in-house attorney and ensure that from the legal standpoint as well as the process capability, contractual requirement standpoint, you guys are covering your bases on everything that you've signed up to do within that contract. You may be able to word something again in consultation with your counsel or your attorneys to limit the risk, but ultimately signing up to that contract puts the risk onto your shoulders. So you want to make sure that you're understanding what that is, accounting for the costs, or doing things to help reduce or limit the liability or the risk associated with the contract. And then the last question right now, under what conditions are an email message between customers and suppliers legally binding contracts? I'll say a lot of cases, the statement of work or the terms and conditions define specifically that emails don't change the contract and that it requires a contract amendment in order for it to be modified. There are some situations or some companies where an email is perfect. An email covers you. But it really depends on the language that's within that contract and the scope of the work being performed in order to answer that. I wish this was a one-size-fits-all type situation, but frankly it's not. Again, we live in a very litigious society, so every company in the world is looking to do what's in their best interest to cover themselves. Our conversation here is more to stir that thought within your organization and ensure that you guys understand what you're signing up to and ensure that you understand the costs of signing up to it so that you're not giving away business, you're not giving away the farm, you're not losing profitability for some of the administrative type functions that you're required to do. So that's the extent of the questions it looks like. Does anybody have anything else to add? Go ahead and type it in. Otherwise, I want to say on behalf of NSF, thanks for attending. Thanks for your participation. And as we've said before, please, please, please feel free to type an email to any one of us, and we'd be happy to get you answers to the best of our ability. In addition, if you have suggestions for future topics, or if you want to go download some of the past topics and consult that information, the links are there. Katie will be sending out an email with all of the information surrounding this presentation, and we hope that it helps you, and we hope that it makes your company bigger, faster, cheaper, and stronger. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend.